Okay, bulk fermentation is done. It's been 5 hours since we started this process. Normally, the bulk fermentation for this recipe takes 4 to 4.5 hours. Today, it went 5 hours. It's just barely at 30% rise. I can't explain why we didn't quite hit 30% as soon as I've hit it in the past. The temperature was slightly under, but not significantly. These things happen. The dough still looks pretty good. It's just not quite as bubbly on top and as active as I would see it at the end of bulk fermentation, but it seems to have plateaued here, so we're going to move on. So the next step normally would be dividing and pre-shaping of the loaves. I've already essentially divided into these 5 containers, and we're not doing any pre-shaping or final shaping. We're just going to bake up these slabs of dough as is. So let's take a look at the 5 batches. So just looking at the 5 batches, there's not a significant difference here, just looking at them from the top. This one, interestingly, was the last loaf that I handled. This was my number 3 loaf, the tartine heavy handling. It has the lowest rise, which makes sense because I was handling that so late into the bulk fermentation process. So as you do your handling later and later in the process, the dough doesn't have time to recover for the yeast to reinflate the dough because you're degassing it every time you're handling it. And then here, the no knead loaf actually had probably the best rise, followed by the tartine light handling, which had the second best rise. That makes sense because I stopped handling these much earlier in the process. And then the laminated loaf, this was the coil fold and lamination number 5, which we stopped handling partway through the process, but this one did not quite rise as much as the others. It just looks a little bit more compressed than the others, and again, it might have just been because of the lamination or the number of coil folds and handling that we did. That was the most handling of any of the loaves in terms of number of layers. We had 48 layers of folds in this one. So if we just do a recap of the number of layers, 0 layers were added to this one. The tartine light was 4 stretch and folds, that's 16 layers. Tartine heavy handling was 8 stretch and folds, that's 32 layers. Coil folding, we did 4 of those at 8 each, that's 32 layers. And then coil folding plus lamination was 48 layers. So we'll now transfer these into my shaping baskets. We'll put these into the refrigerator for an overnight cold retard, and we'll bake these up in the morning and then slice them open and assess what happened. So for my shaping baskets, I've just been using these loaf pans with linen towels in them. These pans are a little large for my 250 gram flour weight loaves that I typically do in these experiments, so I have a little modification. I made these little inserts in my shop so that I can essentially shrink down these pans for 250 gram flour weight loaves. So I'm going to try these out today. I use a towel that has 50% bread flour and 50% rice flour in a mix that I rub into the towel to keep it from sticking. And now the tricky part is I'm not sure exactly how to get these out of these containers without over handling them. I'm just going to try this one first. Okay, that was really a mess. I got it out, but I really handled that a lot. So I'm just going to flour the top to try to smooth that out a little bit. This dough looks really nice. I mean, it's holding its structure really well. This is the no knead loaf, basically. And I'm not doing any pre-shaping. I'm just trying to get some semblance of a little bit of flour on one side of it so that we can establish the crust and keep it from sticking to my makeshift bannetons. I'm not doing any final shaping. This literally gets flipped over. That dough feels beautiful. I wish I was shaping these. And that goes into my pan. That's it. That's loaf number 1, no knead loaf. Loaf number 2, this is our tartine light handling 4 stretch and folds. I'm going to try a little different technique to get this one out. It might come out a little easier. Yeah, that's going to work a little bit better. Still sticking horribly to my hand. Loaf number 2. Into the basket. Now this dough really does feel different. This was my tartine heavy handling, which was the last batch that I handled, if you recall. And it might just be because I was handling it so late in the process, and by handling it 8 times, I probably added more water to it every time I was wetting my hand. So this just feels like a wet loaf to me. It looks wet. So that's the impact of just dipping your hand in that water 8 times. That adds quite a bit of hydration to this loaf, apparently, is what happened here. That loaf looks pretty good. Into the shaping basket, no pre-shaping, number 3. Number 4, this is my coil folded loaf. We've coil folded this 4 times. Now this dough, as I'm pulling it out, I can actually feel the height of this dough. It has a different feel to it than the others. It just has a taller feel and more structure. There we go. I'm getting a little better at that. Now look how that's standing up. I mean, just by pouring that out onto the countertop, you can just see that that loaf has more structure in it than the prior 3 loaves. Just in terms of the verticality of the sides of it, it's pretty impressive. So that was our 4 coil folds. That was 32 layers that we added. And then we did not handle this one for quite a long time. We were done with those coil folds 90 minutes into the process. So this really had a chance to sit and bulk ferment. That's a nice looking slab of dough right there. Into the basket. Number 5, coil fold with lamination. This is where we built the most height, 48 layers in this one. I can feel it immediately as I put my hand in here. This just has more height to it and a little bit more firmness. There we are. Again, just standing up on the countertop, I can see the sides of this standing up like a cliff edge. It just has some real structure to it that's visible here. Into the pan. There we are. So we have our 5 loaves, different type of bulk fermentation handling on each one. The actual bulk fermentation time and temperature was exactly the same. We just handled them all differently. No pre-shaping, no final shaping. I'm going to put these into the refrigerator for a cold proof. These will go about 14 hours. We'll bake them up in the morning. It is the morning of the next day and we are ready to bake the loaves. Let's take a moment and briefly review where we are with the 5 loaves. So we basically mixed up a batch of dough for 5 250-gram flour weight loaves of bread. We did a 40-minute fermentalise, which included the leaven, water, and flour. Then we added the salt. We kneaded that in and let it sit for about 20 minutes. So we essentially did a 1-hour premix with a combination of the fermentalise and adding the salt. Then I divided the dough into 5 equal parts, and we did different types of handling on bulk fermentation for the 5 loaves. Loaf number 1 is a no-knead loaf. We didn't touch it. I just took that slab of raw dough, put it into a bowl, and let that sit for 5 hours. Loaf number 2 followed the Tartine Basic Country Loaf minimum handling recommendation in bulk fermentation, which is 4 stretch and folds. Each stretch and fold adds 4 layers to the dough, so we created 16 layers through that handling and bulk fermentation. Loaf number 3 was also following the Tartine stretch and fold method, but this was a very heavy handling version of that recipe where we did 8 stretch and folds, which is even beyond what people recommend. We did one every 30 minutes for 3.5 hours into bulk fermentation. That created 32 layers in the dough. It's also important to note that we were still handling that dough very late into the bulk fermentation process. 3.5 hours in, we were still stretching and folding that dough. So that's also an example of a very late handled loaf. Loaf number 4 is our coil folded loaf, where we did 4 gentle coil folds that created 32 layers in the dough. Similar to loaf number 3, which was our tartine heavy handling, also created 32 layers, but we did those 8 at a time using the coil folding method. So we were finished handling that dough 90 minutes into bulk fermentation. So those two will be a good comparison to each other. And then loaf number 5 is our coil folding with lamination, where we did 2 coil folds, 1 lamination, and then 3 more coil folds. So really extreme stacking of that dough. Those combinations add 48 layers to the dough through that process, and we were handling that dough up to about 2 hours into bulk fermentation. Those are the recap of the 5 loaves. I'm going to get these out of the refrigerator. They've been doing an overnight cold retard, cold proof in the refrigerator for about 13.5 hours. I'm going to bake these 2 at a time. I have 2 Dutch ovens and 2 ovens. I'm preheating my oven right now to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 260 degrees Celsius. I bake these for 20 minutes with the lid on, with the temperature reduced to 450 degrees. That's 232 degrees Celsius. Then we take the lid off, and I bake them for somewhere between another 15 to 20 minutes, monitoring them for completeness. So they usually take between a total of 35 and 40 minutes. All of these should bake up exactly the same way. I'll get these out of the refrigerator. I'll do a simple scoring, and I'll bake these. I don't expect to see a lot of differences in these loaves coming out of the refrigerator, but I do like to include this in the video because sometimes as the loaves come out of the oven, we will see some differences in the oven spring and things of that nature based on the structure of the loaf. So I'm including this for purposes of having all the details included. Loaf number 1 is out of the refrigerator. Let's score and bake this. These have been in my refrigerator overnight. Normally I put these on a lower shelf in my refrigerator, which stays around 39 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 4 degrees Celsius. I put these on the top shelf of my refrigerator, which is always a little bit warmer. I check the temperature. I have a thermometer sitting right on top of the loaves in there. It actually is showing 44 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a little higher than I expected. That's 7.2 degrees Celsius. So these might have proofed a little bit more in the refrigerator than normal. I use 100% rice flour to dust the bottoms of these so they don't stick. I use parchment paper that I cut into this pattern so that it doesn't mess up the shape of the loaf. That's a really nicely shaped loaf. My little pan inserts worked really effectively here. Gave me a little bit taller shape in these pans, which were slightly larger than what I needed, so I improvised. Now I will score all these loaves exactly the same way. I just do 1 slash just right of center. Now, as I cut through that, I can feel the dough feels pretty firm. That's the first thing that I look for when I slash these coming out of the refrigerator, is to see, does the loaf feel slack? Does it start to sit down and relax at all? This is standing up pretty nicely, and it still feels, like I said, relatively firm. So that's a good sign that this loaf sufficiently fermented and has some decent structure to it. This is our no knead loaf, untouched by human hands. After I did the mixing of the dough, this sat for 5 hours in bulk fermentation, about 13.5 hours in the refrigerator for the cold retard. Let's bake it up. Okay, loaf number 1 is done. It's out of the oven. It baked up a little more quickly than usual. It took 34 minutes, 20 minutes with the lid on, 14 minutes with the lid off. This is our no knead loaf. That is a surprisingly good looking loaf. So this loaf has no pre-shaping, no final shaping, no handling at all during bulk fermentation. This is basically a slab of bulk fermented dough that I didn't really touch this after the initial premix of the flour, water, leaven, and salt. This bulk fermented for 5 hours. It opened up on the score. It doesn't have the normal oven spring that you would see in a typical loaf. So that's where you can see the effect of not shaping this loaf, because we did not build any type of surface tension. You didn't get that typical oven spring, although it did open up on the scoring. There's a tiny ear there, actually, which is amazing for no handling. And the other interesting thing is if I look down in the seam here where it opened up on the scoring, you don't see the lateral strands of gluten the way that you typically do in a loaf. I'm just seeing like bubbles in here that imply that this is just kind of a bubbly, irregular open crumb, if there is an open crumb in here, without any real structure to the gluten, which would make sense because we didn't do any of the typical things that add structure to the gluten, like stretch and fold, coil fold, or lamination. We're going to let this cool for 90 minutes and then we will cut it open. Loaf number 2 is ready for scoring and baking. Loaf number 2 is our standard tartine loaf. We did 4 stretch and folds in the first 90 minutes of bulk fermentation, and then this one sat for the longest time untouched in bulk fermentation. That's another nice tall looking loaf. Let's score it. Let's get this in the oven and bake it up. Okay, loaf number 2 is done. These are all baking up a little bit more quickly. This one also baked up in 34 minutes. This is my tartine standard loaf with 4 stretch and folds. So we added 16 layers in the dough during the bulk fermentation handling. This has spectacular oven spring. I mean, just look at how that loaf opened up. This is with no pre-shaping and no final shaping. So that somewhat explains why, even though it opened up on the ear, you see it was really an irregular explosion on the ear, because the dough just kind of goes where it wants to go when you don't really build that surface tension and do the shaping. So you're seeing some of these imperfections in the shape caused by the absence of pre-shaping and final shaping. But in terms of the oven spring and the height of that loaf, that is really quite tremendous. And in this one, I can see more of the gluten strands in here cutting across my scoring versus loaf number 1, which was my no knead loaf. Just look at the side view of those two, and you see the height that we got from the tartine 4 stretch and fold version, quite different. So can't wait to cut these open. We're going to let these continue to cool and keep baking. We are ready to score and bake loaf number 3. Now, these are sitting in the refrigerator slightly longer, 45 minutes longer than the first 2 loaves. I don't believe that has any material impact on the proofing, because you're talking about the difference between 14 hours and 14 3/4 hours. If you're interested in this, I have a video called The Long Cold Proof, where I baked 6 loaves and left them in the refrigerator anywhere from 1 to 5 days. And I can tell you unequivocally from that experiment that 1 hour of extra proofing in the refrigerator does not make a material impact on the crumb or the way that these bake up, based on that experiment. But I did move all the loaves down to the lower shelf in my refrigerator, which is a couple degrees cooler, and I'm trying to move through the baking as quickly as possible to keep this as scientifically accurate as we can. Okay, loaf number 3, this is my tartine with heavy handling. And very interestingly, this loaf is spreading out. This is a very slack loaf compared to the other 2, which really stood up coming out of my makeshift bannetons. This loaf feels loose to me, even just coming out of the shaping basket. So if you recall, this was the one where we did 8 stretch and folds. So we created 32 layers in the dough, but we were handling this dough really late into the bulk fermentation process, 3.5 hours into bulk fermentation. We were still doing stretch and folds. And when this came out of the final vessel at the end of bulk fermentation, I noted how soft this loaf was. One other factor that potentially influenced this is by doing the 8 stretch and folds, and I was dipping my hand in that cup of water to keep my hand from sticking, I was adding a few grams of water to this every time I did those stretch and folds. So this dough was also more wet coming out of bulk fermentation. We'll see what it looks like when we bake it and slice it open, but this is noticeably different in that it's a relaxed, softer loaf, even though these all came from the same batch of bulk fermented dough. I can tell even when I'm scoring that the end points here are almost down to the countertop. This loaf is just a flat, saggy loaf compared to the prior two. Let's get this in the oven and bake it out. Loaf number 3 is out of the oven. This is my tartine with 8 stretch and folds. This is my heavy handling. That's a gorgeous loaf. No pre-shaping, no final shaping. I got an ear to open up. The scoring bloomed really beautifully. You can see the gluten strand slashing across where it opened up. The shape is pretty good, blistering on the crust. I mean, if you told me that this loaf had no pre-shaping and no final shaping, I really wouldn't believe it. So we're seeing an improvement here as we're going through the loaves successively. I'll come back at the end and compare all 5 of these. But this one had 32 layers that we built through 8 stretch and folds, and we were handling this loaf very late into bulk fermentation, 3.5 hours into bulk fermentation. I was still folding this, and it does not appear to be any detrimental impacts, at least on the outside of the loaf. Got good height, and this was also a pretty slack, pretty wet loaf coming out of the refrigerator and out of bulk fermentation. So we'll let this cool, and then we will cut it open. These are all baking up to 212 degrees, 211 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly 100 degrees Celsius. 34 minutes on that one also. Loaf number 4 is ready for scoring and baking. If you recall, loaf number 4 was our coil folded loaf, where we did 4 coil folds in the first 90 minutes of bulk fermentation. This created 32 layers in the dough. Each time you do a coil fold creates 8 layers. This will be a good comparison to our tartine light handled loaf, where we also did 4 stretch and folds in the first 90 minutes. So both of these had handling in the first 90 minutes, but the coil folded loaf had 2 times the number of layers created versus the tartine loaf. Now, the first thing I notice here is that unlike the prior loaf, which was the heavy-handled tartine loaf, this is standing straight up. So this loaf has a lot of structure. You can tell just by looking at the dough. And again, we stopped handling this 90 minutes into bulk fermentation versus the tartine heavy-handled loaf, the prior loaf, which we were still stretching and folding 3.5 hours into bulk fermentation. This also had more layers that we created. Let's score it and bake it. Let's get it in the oven. Loaf 4 is done. This is our coil folded loaf. We did 4 coil folds, created 32 layers in the dough. I can't really believe what I'm looking at here. This is a loaf with no pre-shaping and no final shaping. I mean, just look at that. We got a tremendous ear, gorgeous bloom of the loaf. The shape of the loaf is actually really nicely shaped with no actual pre-shaping and no final shaping. It's a little bit mind-boggling what I'm looking at right here. This looks better than some of my normal loaves that I've baked with the best pre-shaping and the best final shaping I know how to do. This is really extraordinary. I can't wait to cut these open and see what the rest of the story tells on the inside. But from the outside, this loaf number 4 is a standout. Loaf number 5 is ready for scoring and baking. This is the last one out of the refrigerator. All of my loaves travel with their own thermometer. This one was at 40 degrees. I moved all these to the lower level of the refrigerator. That's 4.4 degrees Celsius. Once I started baking, just to try to keep the proofing time as relatively close as possible, because I can only bake 2 loaves at a time in my oven. I don't believe that the extra roughly 90 minutes at 40 degrees Fahrenheit had any impact on the proofing of this loaf at all. So this is loaf number 5, our coil folded with lamination loaf. We did 5 coil folds and 1 lamination, created 48 layers in the handling during bulk fermentation. Let's score this and bake it. That's a real nice firm loaf, really standing up tall. That feels like a real nice loaf to me, just looking at how all the loaves came out of the refrigerator. This one definitely has some structure to it. So loaf number 5 is out of the oven. This is another spectacular loaf. I mean, just look at the height, the ear, the bloom on the scoring, the symmetry of that loaf. I mean, that is really extraordinary. This is a loaf with no pre-shaping and no final shaping. If you told me that, if I hadn't baked it myself, I wouldn't believe it. That's just an incredible looking loaf. You can just see the height and the symmetry of it is amazing. This was our coil fold and laminated loaf. We did 5 coil folds plus 1 lamination. That created 48 layers of dough during bulk fermentation. You can see the impact that that has just by creating the structure. I mean, the height and symmetry of this are quite extraordinary. So the purpose of this experiment is really to look at the impact on open crumb, but I can say just looking at the impact on the shape of the loaves, there's a whole nother aspect of learning that will come from this experiment, because the shape and the height is extraordinarily impacted by what I'm seeing here coming out of the handling and bulk fermentation, whereas I previously would have assumed a lot of that was coming from pre-shaping and final shaping. So that's a big surprise. So there's a lot to learn here. Let's let these loaves cool for 90 minutes, and then we will cut them open and inspect the crumb.